Commander Blake slammed his hand on the cold steel table with enough force to rattle the metal chair bolted to the floor. Frustration boiled beneath his weathered skin, evident in the deep lines etched across his face and the vein pulsing at his temple. Before him sat a woman in nondescript civilian clothes, dark jeans, a black turtleneck, nothing that revealed her identity or allegiance. SEAL Team 7 surrounded the interrogation room like statues carved from granite, their assault rifles held at ready position, their eyes narrowed with the kind of suspicion only men trained to kill acquired after decades of survival. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls. The woman had been brought in by intelligence operatives who'd intercepted her attempting to access classified military servers. Instead of resisting, she'd simply smiled and allowed herself to be arrested. Now, 3 hours into questioning, she remained completely composed, refusing every demand for identification, security clearance codes, or any conventional proof of her authority. It was maddening. She claimed to possess critical intelligence, vital, time-sensitive information about a terrorist network operating across Southeast Asia and planning operations on American soil. The intel she described was specific, detailed, and terrifyingly plausible, but she offered nothing to verify her credentials. Blake had interrogated hundreds of suspects. He'd broken down hardened criminals, extracted confessions from trained operatives, and faced down men who'd sworn they'd never talk. This woman was different. She didn't sweat. She didn't fidget. She didn't show the slightest crack in her composure. Every time he demanded proof, she simply smiled that infuriating smile, as if she knew something he didn't, as if this entire situation was some kind of elaborate game that only she understood the rules to. "I'm running out of patience," Blake growled, leaning forward across the table until his face was inches from hers. His voice carried the weight of command, a sound that had ordered men into battle, that had sent soldiers into hell itself. "You break into our systems. You claim to have intelligence. You refuse to identify yourself. For all I know, you're a mole, a foreign agent, or someone playing games with national security." The woman met his gaze without flinching. Her dark eyes were calm, almost amused, as if she found his anger not threatening but endearing. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried an edge of absolute authority. "Commander, with all due respect, I understand your skepticism. If I were in your position, I'd react the same way. But here's the problem. The proof you're asking for doesn't exist in any database you can access. The clearance codes you want are encrypted through channels you don't have authorization to view. The identification you demand was burned along with every other record of my existence 5 years ago." Blake felt his jaw clench. This was exactly the kind of nonsense that wasted precious time. "Then you're useless to us," he said coldly, straightening up. He gestured to 2 of his men. "Take her back to the holding cell. We're done here." The woman stood slowly, calmly, showing no fear as armed SEALs moved toward her. She held up her hands, not in surrender but in a gesture asking for patience. "Before you dismiss me completely, hear me out one more time." Her voice carried such absolute conviction that even Blake paused. "You want proof, real proof, the kind that can't be faked, can't be stolen, can't be questioned." Blake stopped, turning back to face her. Something in her tone had shifted. The casual confidence had transformed into something deeper, absolute certainty mixed with gravity. Every SEAL in the room felt it. "Then prepare yourself for the truth," she continued, her eyes locked with Blake's. "Because once you see what I'm about to show you, there will be no more questions, no more doubt, no more room for skepticism, and you'll understand exactly who I am and why your country needs me right now." The commander studied her face for a long moment, searching for deception, finding none. Against his better judgment, against every protocol in the handbook, he nodded slowly. "Show me," he commanded. The woman's lips curved into a knowing smile. Deliberately, with movements that seemed almost ceremonial, she reached for the collar of her black turtleneck and began to pull it downward, exposing the smooth skin of her shoulder. Every SEAL in the room leaned forward slightly, weapons still ready, watching as something appeared on her skin that would change everything. Slowly, deliberately, with the precision of someone performing a sacred ritual, the woman turned away from the interrogation table. Her movements were controlled, measured, as if she understood the weight of what she was about to reveal. The seals shifted slightly, hands tightening on weapons, eyes narrowing as they tried to anticipate what came next. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across her back as she pulled the black turtleneck downward, inch by inch, exposing pale skin that had seen sun and shadow in equal measure. Then Blake saw it. A tattoo sprawled across her shoulder blade, not some decorative design or personal emblem, but something far more significant. The intricate pattern consisted of geometric shapes arranged in a very specific configuration. A phoenix rising from stylized flames, but within the phoenix's body were numbers and symbols that meant nothing to most people. To the seals in this room, however, those markings were unmistakable. They were the mark of Operation Phantom Spear. Commander Blake's entire body went rigid. His breath caught in his throat. Around the room, seals reacted with visible shock, hands dropping slightly, shoulders tensing, eyes widening. Operation Phantom Spear was a legend within military circles, something whispered about in classified briefings and secret meetings. It was a black operations division so classified, so compartmentalized, that fewer than a dozen operatives in the entire United States government even knew of its existence. Blake himself had only learned about it through a need-to-know briefing 5 years ago, when he'd been selected for a special assignment that required understanding the landscape of American intelligence operations. The division didn't officially exist. There were no records, no budgets, no organizational charts. Operatives in Phantom Spear had their identities erased. Their families were told they died in accidents or disappeared without explanation. They operated in shadow, in the spaces between official operations, handling situations too sensitive or too dangerous for standard protocols. They were ghosts, real ghosts, not the metaphorical kind. Blake had never met anyone bearing the Phantom Spear tattoo. He'd assumed all operatives were men, military trained from birth, groomed through special programs. The idea that this woman, this calm, composed woman who'd walked into their facility demanding access to classified servers, was a Phantom Spear operative seemed impossible. And yet, the tattoo was undeniable. He'd seen photographs of it in the classified briefing. He'd memorized every detail, every curve, every symbol. The woman turned back around, slowly pulling her shirt up to cover the mark once more. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The tattoo had said everything that needed saying. Blake found himself unable to form words. He'd spent 3 hours interrogating her, demanding credentials, doubting her every claim. He'd been ready to throw her in a cell and forget about her. And all along, she'd been something far beyond his comprehension. Around the room, the SEALs were processing the same realization, their faces shifting from suspicion to shock to something approaching awe. One of the senior operators, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran with more combat experience than most generals, slowly lowered his rifle. Then, without a word, without waiting for command, he rendered a salute. His back straightened, his arm moved with precision, his eyes fixed forward with the respect due to a superior officer and fellow warrior. The other SEALs followed. One by one, they lowered their weapons and rendered salutes. The room filled with the quiet sound of movement, the scrape of boots against concrete, the subtle shift of uniforms as trained soldiers demonstrated the ultimate form of respect. These were men who saluted presidents and generals, men whose salutes carried weight because they were given sparingly and only when truly earned. Blake remained motionless for a moment longer, processing what he was witnessing. Then slowly, deliberately, he rose from his chair. His hand moved to his chest, his arm extended, and he too rendered a salute to the woman before him. When he spoke, his voice was different, no longer commanding, no longer skeptical, but filled with the kind of respect reserved for legend and myth made flesh. "Agent Chen," he said quietly, though she hadn't yet told them her name. Somehow he knew. Welcome to SEAL Team 7. We have a situation that requires your expertise. Sarah Chen pulled her shirt back into place with deliberate composure, adjusting the fabric as if the past 5 minutes hadn't fundamentally shifted the power dynamics in the room. She moved to the head of the interrogation table with the natural authority of someone accustomed to command, and without hesitation or permission, she sat down. The SEALs instinctively repositioned themselves, arranging their chairs in a semicircle facing her rather than surrounding her like suspects. Blake remained standing, his mind racing to process what this revelation meant. "First, let me explain why I broke into your systems," Sarah began, her voice carrying the measured precision of someone accustomed to briefing high-level officials. "I didn't do it to steal information or compromise security. I did it because I needed to trigger a specific response. I needed your team's attention, and I needed it immediately. Direct channels would have taken weeks. Bureaucratic protocols would have buried my request under a mountain of administrative procedures. I didn't have weeks. I didn't have time for procedures." She pulled an encrypted tablet from her jacket and placed it on the table. Blake's security officers tensed, but Sarah raised her hand in a calming gesture. "This is isolated from any network. It contains everything you need to understand the situation." She activated the screen, and satellite imagery appeared, a compound nestled in the mountainous jungle terrain of northern Thailand, surrounded by defensive barriers and armed checkpoints. "For the past 18 months, I've been embedded within a terrorist organization designated as the Crescent Brotherhood," Sarah continued, her tone shifting into the clinical language of intelligence briefing. "They're not your typical extremist cell. They're well-funded, highly organized, and operating with a level of sophistication that suggests state-level backing, possibly Iranian, possibly Chinese, possibly private oligarchs. They have operatives across 12 countries, financial assets exceeding $200 million, and access to weapons systems that shouldn't exist in the private sector." She swiped the tablet and new images appeared, building schematics, personnel photographs, financial documents. "I infiltrated the organization by posing as a weapons broker with connections to Russian military suppliers. For 18 months, I earned their trust through a series of successful operations. I've attended their strategic planning sessions. I've met their leadership. I've documented their supply chains, their communication protocols, their weaknesses." Blake leaned forward, his military instincts recognizing the gravity of what she was describing. "You said your identity was compromised. How?" Sarah's expression darkened. 3 days ago, one of my cover stories was partially exposed through social media analytics. Nothing definitive. A photograph from 7 years ago that didn't match one of my supposed identities. Subtle inconsistencies in my backstory, but enough to trigger suspicion. The Crescent Brotherhood's internal security chief is thorough. He's been running counterintelligence operations, and I became a person of interest. She pulled up a communication intercept, showing encrypted messages in a language Blake didn't recognize. Sarah translated, "They're planning to execute me, but before they do, they're accelerating their primary operation. They believe I've already reported to someone, so they're moving their timeline from 6 weeks to 72 hours. The room fell silent. Blake felt the weight of those words settle across his shoulders like a lead blanket. "What's the operation?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "Coordinated attacks on American infrastructure and government facilities. 3 separate teams, 3 different targets, all designed to maximize casualties and psychological impact. They have operatives positioned in Los Angeles, New York, and Washington, D.C. They have explosives, small arms, and what intelligence suggests might be chemical or biological components. The Crescent Brotherhood wants to make a statement that will echo across the world." She displayed photographs of 3 individuals, operatives positioned in each city, already in place, already waiting. "These 3 are the operational commanders. They answer directly to the cell's leadership here in Thailand. If we eliminate the source, if we take out the headquarters and the senior leadership, we can disrupt the command structure. Without orders from their superiors, the field teams will likely stand down or attempt to scatter. But we have a 72-hour window, and it's closing rapidly. Blake looked at his men, then back at Sarah. Why come to us? Why not go through official channels, contact the CIA, the NSA? Sarah's expression was grim. Because there's a mole somewhere in the intelligence community, someone feeding information to the Crescent Brotherhood. I don't know who, and I can't trust anyone outside this room. The Brotherhood knew about my infiltration too quickly, too thoroughly. Someone in our government is compromised. SEAL Team 7 is small, compartmentalized, and your team has maintained operational security that's never been breached. You're the only asset I can trust. Blake felt the burden of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. We're going to need more than 72 hours for proper planning. Sarah met his gaze directly. Then we'd better work fast, Commander, because in 72 hours, thousands of Americans will die if we don't stop this, and I'll be dead, along with any intelligence I've gathered. The operations center transformed into a controlled frenzy of activity. Sarah sat at the head of a massive tactical table, surrounded by SEAL Team 7 and a carefully vetted group of intelligence analysts. Maps of northern Thailand covered one wall, satellite imagery of the compound covered another, and a third displayed organizational charts of the Crescent Brotherhood's leadership structure. The fluorescent lights burned relentlessly as Sarah began her comprehensive briefing, speaking without notes, pulling information from her memory with the precision of a soldier who'd spent 18 months absorbing every detail of her environment. The compound sits at an elevation of approximately 800 meters above sea level, Sarah explained, pointing to the satellite image with a laser pointer. Her finger traced the perimeter. 3 main entrances: the northern gate, which is the primary access road, the eastern service entrance used for supply deliveries, and a southern emergency exit that supposedly leads to a hidden route through the jungle, though I've never actually seen it used. The compound itself covers approximately 12 acres, with barracks for 40 permanent security personnel, administrative buildings, weapon storage facilities, and a central command center housed in the reinforced concrete structure here. Chief Rodriguez studied the layout intently, his weathered face creased in concentration. Guard rotations. Standard military protocol, Sarah responded without hesitation. 4-hour shifts with changeover at 0600, 1000, 1400, and 1800 hours. They're disciplined but not exceptional. Most of the security personnel are hired mercenaries, competent fighters, but lacking the fanatical commitment that makes fundamentalist operatives unpredictable. They follow procedures religiously, which makes them predictable. She swiped to a new image showing interior schematics. The command center where the leadership conducts operations is here, in the eastern wing. That's where I've attended all strategic planning sessions. Khalid Hassan, the organization's military commander, keeps his office on the 2nd floor. That's where the master communication systems are located, where the orders for the American operations are being transmitted. A younger SEAL, Lieutenant James Patterson, raised his hand. What about electronic defenses? Cameras, motion sensors, communications jamming? Sarah pulled up a detailed technical schematic. They have a CCTV network covering all entrances and primary corridors, but they have significant blind spots in the compound's western section. There's a storage area they consider low priority. They have motion sensors at the perimeter fence and all main entrances, but the sensor coverage has gaps if you approach from the northeastern hillside. As for communications, they use encrypted satellite uplinks for sensitive transmissions. I can provide you with the encryption protocols, though your signals intelligence team will need to verify compatibility with your systems. She turned to face the team directly, her expression becoming more serious. I want to be clear about something. Several of you have reservations about bringing an embedded operative into a combat situation. I understand that concern. Undercover operatives sometimes become liabilities in firefights. We freeze, we hesitate, We're not accustomed to direct engagement. But I need you to understand what I've been doing for 18 months. I haven't just been gathering intelligence. I've been participating in operations. I've conducted reconnaissance missions for the Brotherhood. I've participated in training exercises. I'm combat qualified, and I'm familiar with this specific terrain in ways you won't be, no matter how good your preparation is. Blake watched as she stood and moved to a wall map showing the jungle terrain surrounding the compound. The approaches to the compound are treacherous. Steep elevation changes, dense vegetation, hidden ravines that aren't visible on satellite imagery. I can navigate this terrain in darkness. I know where the informal guard patrol routes are located. I know which areas are considered secure enough that security personnel don't actively monitor them. That knowledge is valuable. And when we're extracting you under fire, Rodriguez asked pointedly, when rounds are flying and adrenaline is pumping. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Then you'll discover that I've survived 18 months embedded with people whose primary purpose is violence. I haven't survived by being fragile or indecisive. I've survived because I can kill as efficiently as any of you, and I can do it without hesitation when the situation demands it. A long moment of silence followed her statement. Blake could see his men processing this information, reassessing their assumptions about this woman. Sarah continued, I've also prepared contingency plans for every major scenario. Here's what happens if we encounter unexpected resistance on the approach. Here's the secondary extraction route if the primary route is compromised. Here's how we create a diversion at the northern gate while the main team infiltrates from the east. She spent the next 16 hours walking the team through every conceivable contingency. By the time she finished, the SEALs weren't just accepting her presence. They were integrating her into their operational planning as a full team member. Respect had been earned through knowledge and competence, far more powerful than any tattoo could convey. As dawn broke on the second day of preparation, Blake realized Sarah had transformed from an unknown asset into something more dangerous and more valuable. She was a soldier they could trust with their lives. The Black Hawk helicopter descended through darkness, so complete it seemed tangible, a living thing that swallowed light and hope alike. The rotors thundered overhead, the sound carefully modulated to minimize detection as the aircraft approached the designated insertion point 2 miles northwest of the compound. Inside the cabin, SEAL Team 7 sat in disciplined silence, each man lost in the familiar pre-combat meditation that separated warriors from ordinary soldiers. Sarah sat among them, her equipment checked and rechecked, her breathing steady and controlled, her dark eyes focused on some distant point only she could see. Blake sat directly across from her, watching as she methodically verified her gear one final time. Her fingers moved through the ritual with practiced precision, checking the magazine in her Sig Sauer P226, verifying the tactical knife secured to her thigh, confirming the encrypted communication device fitted into her ear. She moved like a ghost, economical in motion, purposeful in every gesture. When their eyes met across the dim cargo cabin, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared purpose, of trust earned through preparation and validated through competence. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets, 2 minutes to insertion. The team rose in unison, a single organism responding to instinct and training. The helicopter's side door slid open, and the humid jungle air rushed in, carrying the scent of earth and vegetation and things best left unnamed. 30 meters below, the dark canopy of the Thai jungle stretched in every direction, a landscape of shadows and silence. This was their domain now, not streets or buildings or conventional terrain, but the primal wilderness where combat stripped away all pretense and revealed only survival. Sarah moved to the door and stepped into the night without hesitation. The rope slid through her rappelling equipment as she descended, her boots finding purchase on the woven fiber as easily as if she were walking down a staircase. Blake followed, then Rodriguez, then the rest of the team, 8 warriors descending into darkness like angels falling from heaven. The moment Blake's boots touched solid ground, the jungle embraced them. The sound of the helicopter faded as it climbed back into the night sky, leaving the team in almost absolute silence. They moved as shadows themselves, 10 figures becoming part of the forest, their movements practiced and silent. Sarah took point, moving through terrain that most soldiers would have found impassable, navigating by instinct and memory. Blake followed 3 meters behind her, his weapon at ready position, his eyes scanning for threats both seen and unseen. They moved for 2 hours through the jungle night. The terrain was brutal, steep climbs alternating with treacherous descents, vegetation that seemed designed by nature to snare and slow intruders, insects that bite and poisonous plants that burned on contact. But Sarah moved through it all without complaint, without hesitation, without deviation from her chosen path. When she raised her hand signaling halt, the team froze instantly. Ahead, through a gap in the vegetation, the compound became visible. Lights illuminated the perimeter fence, casting harsh shadows across the darkened grounds. Guard towers rose at each corner, manned by armed sentries who watched the night with the boredom of men performing routine duty. Sarah pointed to the southwestern approach, where the terrain sloped away toward the fence line. There was a natural depression, a ravine created by centuries of water erosion, that approached within 50 meters of the perimeter without exposing the team to direct sight lines. Blake nodded, and the team moved forward, using the terrain as concealment, sliding down the slope toward the depression. Rodriguez carried the portable signal disruptor, a device designed to temporarily blind electronic sensors without triggering alarms. As they reached their position, he activated it, and the perimeter motion sensors went offline for precisely 4 minutes. That was their window. Sarah moved first, sprinting across the open ground toward the fence, her weapon in one hand while her other hand worked the cutting tool through the chain-link barrier. The fence fell away before them like paper, and the team poured through the breach. They were inside the perimeter now, committed, with no retreat except through violence. The compound rose before them, dark buildings silhouetted against the glow of exterior lights. Sarah led them toward the Eastern Service entrance, moving along shadows cast by maintenance buildings, keeping to the darkest paths. They were 40 meters from the building when the first guard appeared around the corner. Everything happened simultaneously. Sarah's weapon rose with mechanical precision. The guard barely had time to recognize the threat before rounds tore through his body. He fell without sound, without struggle, his weapon clattering against concrete. The team had trained for this. Weapons discipline maintained despite adrenaline, focus absolute despite danger. "Go," Sarah whispered into her communication device, and the team advanced toward the service entrance. Then, as if heaven itself had turned against them, floodlights blazed to life across the compound. Alarm sirens shrieked into the night, a sound that transformed the operation from infiltration to all-out assault in a single heartbeat. They knew, Blake realized with ice-cold certainty. "They knew," Sarah confirmed, her voice steady as she raised her weapon toward the emerging shapes of armed defenders materializing from every building. "And now we fight." Gunfire erupted from multiple positions simultaneously, a cacophony of violence that transformed the compound into a hell of muzzle flashes and ricocheting rounds. Blake's team returned fire with disciplined precision, each seal operating as part of a greater whole, covering sectors, eliminating threats, advancing methodically despite overwhelming resistance. But the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Brotherhood had been prepared, their defensive positions well established, their ammunition seemingly limitless. Sarah moved like a specter through the chaos, her weapon speaking with lethal eloquence. She identified targets with uncanny accuracy, shooting around corners she hadn't seen, eliminating threats before the SEALs even registered their existence. Her 18 months of embedded knowledge was translating into tactical advantage. She understood the compound's layout at a level that transcended mere map study. She knew how the Brotherhood thought, how they would respond, where they would position their forces. "Contact at the northern entrance," Rodriguez called through the communications network. "At least 20 hostiles converging on our position." Blake cursed under his breath. They'd planned for resistance, but not this level of coordination. Whatever element of surprise they'd possessed was gone. The situation was becoming untenable. "Fall back to the eastern building," Blake commanded. "We need to consolidate." But Sarah wasn't falling back. Blake noticed her suddenly changing direction, moving not toward the team's defensive position but toward the central command structure. "Sarah, what are you doing?" he called through the comm. Her voice came back, calm and resolved. "The detonator. They're going to blow the compound." Blake's blood turned to ice. He'd suspected the Brotherhood might have explosives, but the full implications of her statement crashed over him like a wave. If the compound detonated, the entire operation collapsed. More importantly, everyone inside would die. The SEALs, Sarah, whatever intelligence remained. "Fall back," Blake ordered urgently. "That's an order." But Sarah was already running toward the command center, her silhouette visible against the burning vehicles and illuminated buildings. Blake watched helplessly as she sprinted across open ground, rounds tearing up the concrete around her feet. She moved with desperate speed, knowing that every second brought her closer to the moment when someone would press a detonation switch. She reached the command center's eastern entrance and kicked through the reinforced door with explosive force. Blake could see her disappear into darkness, her weapon raised, ready for whatever waited inside. The SEALs were pinned down now, returning fire from behind concrete barriers, their ammunition expenditure climbing toward critical levels. Then Sarah's voice crackled through the communications device. "I've got eyes on the detonator. Second floor, east wing. Someone's got their hand on the trigger." Blake heard her weapon discharge twice, sharp reports that echoed through the compound. Then silence, agonizing silence that stretched for what felt like eternity. "The device is disabled," Sarah reported, her voice slightly breathless. "I've got the detonator. Repeat, I have secured the—" The sniper's shot came from somewhere in the darkness beyond the compound's eastern perimeter. Blake heard the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle, heard the wet impact of the round finding its target, heard Sarah's gasp of pain through the communications device. "Sniper," Blake shouted. "East building, elevated position." Sarah staggered backward, her hand flying to her ribs. She looked down to see blood spreading across her black tactical shirt, the round having punched through her body armor and found purchase in soft tissue. The pain was extraordinary, a fire that consumed her entire right side. Her vision wavered, her knees buckled. But she didn't fall completely. Training overrode agony. Survival instinct superseded conscious thought. Sarah forced herself to remain upright, forced her weapon into firing position despite the screaming agony in her ribcage, forced herself to identify the sniper's position and return fire. Blake watched in stunned horror as Sarah, blood streaming from her wound, continued fighting. She was moving on instinct now, a wounded warrior refusing to surrender despite catastrophic injury. She fired at the building across from her position, forcing the sniper to duck behind cover, buying precious seconds for the team. "Fall back to the eastern building with Sarah," Blake commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Rodriguez, Martinez, cover fire. Everyone else move." Patterson and 2 other SEALs broke from their position and sprinted towards Sarah, laying down suppressing fire as they moved. Sarah saw them coming and tried to advance toward their position, but her legs betrayed her. She fell to one knee, then two, the detonator clattering from her grip as consciousness began to slip away. Patterson reached her first, his massive frame scooping her up with surprising gentleness despite the fury of combat surrounding them. Blood soaked into his uniform as he carried her back toward the team's defensive position, rounds snapping through the air around them, ricocheting off concrete and metal. Blake provided covering fire, his weapon speaking with cold precision, eliminating any threat that dared rise against his men. They were extracting now, falling back toward the insertion point, carrying wounded and equipment with the desperation of soldiers who understood that failure meant death. Sarah hung in Patterson's arms, her eyes closing despite her desperate attempts to remain conscious. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was Blake's face, his expression transforming from command authority to something far more human, concern, respect, and a warrior's acknowledgement that she had just saved all their lives. The jungle erupted into chaos as SEAL Team 7 fought their way toward the extraction zone, carrying their wounded through terrain that seemed designed to impede every step. Patterson held Sarah's unconscious form against his chest, her blood soaking through his uniform, creating a dark stain that spread with each passing second. Blake remained at point position, his weapon clearing threats before they could fully materialize, his mind operating with the cold clarity that only combat could produce. The other SEALs formed a protective perimeter around their wounded teammate, weapons ready, eyes scanning for danger in every shadow. "How much farther?" Patterson gasped, his voice strained under Sarah's weight. She was deadweight now, unconscious, her body limp against his tactical vest. He could feel her pulse against his chest, still strong, still fighting but weakening with each moment that bled away. 500 meters, Blake responded, checking his GPS unit while maintaining suppressive fire. "The extraction point is just ahead." Behind them, the compound was descending into absolute chaos. Fires burned across the grounds, illuminating the night sky with an orange glow that was visible for miles. Brotherhood operatives had abandoned their organized defense and were now scattered, some trying to extinguish fires, some attempting to organize pursuit, some simply trying to survive. But a contingent of well-trained mercenaries was following the SEALs, using the terrain to their advantage, pressing the advantage of superior numbers. "Contact at 2 o'clock, Rodriguez called out, his weapon finding a target in the darkness. 2, maybe 3 hostiles. The SEALs responded with practiced efficiency, their weapons creating overlapping fields of fire that eliminated threats before they could fully emerge from the jungle. But the cost of each engagement was time, and time was something they didn't possess. Sarah's blood continued to drip onto the ground, leaving a trail that any competent tracker could follow. Blake grabbed his communication device, which was linked to the extraction aircraft circling at a safe distance from the compound. "Actual, this is Reaper 1. We have a medical emergency. Priority extraction required. ETA to the zone is 4 minutes." The Black Hawk pilot's voice came back, calm and professional. "Reaper 1 actual, we have your position. Inbound in 3 minutes. LZ is clear. Prepare for emergency extraction." "Roger that," Blake confirmed. He turned to his team. "Push hard, we're almost there." They burst through the final line of jungle vegetation and emerged onto a cleared area, a natural clearing in the forest where the extraction helicopter could land. The Black Hawk was already descending, its rotors creating a downdraft that bent the grass and small trees in concentric circles. The aircraft's side doors were open, and Blake could see the flight crew already positioned, ready to receive the wounded operative. Patterson sprinted the final 100 meters, his legs pumping with desperate strength despite his exhaustion. Behind him, the other SEALs maintained rear security, their weapons still engaged with pursuing Brotherhood forces. Rounds snapped through the air, dangerously close, but none found their marks. The team had been trained for this: extraction under fire, movement in contact, coordinated withdrawal while maintaining firepower superiority. The Black Hawk touched down with surprising gentleness. Patterson didn't wait for it to fully settle. He was already moving toward the open door, Sarah's limp form still cradled against his chest. The flight medic, a young petty officer named Gonzalez, was already waiting, his hands ready to receive the wounded operative. He'd already laid out his equipment, had already assessed the landing zone, had already prepared for emergency trauma intervention. "Gunshot wound, right side, through and through by the look of it," Patterson reported, his voice urgent as he carefully transferred Sarah to the medic's waiting arms. "She's been unconscious for maybe 3 minutes. Strong pulse, but she's losing blood." Gonzalez was already cutting away Sarah's tactical vest and shirt, exposing the wound. Entry and exit wounds marked her ribs, the trauma evident in the torn flesh and the steady stream of blood. He immediately applied a combat tourniquet, not for the limb but for the torso, applying pressure while calling for more equipment. "Get her on the stretcher," Gonzalez commanded, his training overriding everything else. He had one job: keep her alive long enough to reach the hospital. Blake was the last man through the helicopter door, his weapons still trained on the jungle behind them as Rodriguez and Martinez provided final covering fire before jumping into the aircraft. The moment Blake's boots cleared the door frame, he shouted, "Go, go, go." The Black Hawk's pilot didn't need to be told twice. The aircraft lifted with sudden violence, climbing away from the landing zone just as Brotherhood forces emerged from the jungle below, weapons raised in futile attempts to hit the ascending helicopter. Rounds sparked off the fuselage, but none penetrated the armored hull. Blake dropped to his knees beside Sarah, watching as Gonzalez worked frantically to stabilize her. An IV line was established, blood products being administered, bandages applied with practiced efficiency. Sarah's eyes remained closed, her face pale as death itself, but her chest still rose and fell with labored breathing. Blake gripped her shoulder, his weathered hand contrasting sharply with her pale skin. "Hold on," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. "Just hold on, you've come too far to fail now." The helicopter banked toward the coast, where a fully equipped military medical facility waited. Below them, the Thai jungle stretched endlessly, and behind them the compound continued to burn, a funeral pyre for the terrorists Sarah had died fighting, if her body decided to give up the struggle. But Sarah Chen was no ordinary soldier. She had survived 18 months embedded with murderers and fanatics. She had survived interrogation, compromise, and combat. She would not surrender to something as mundane as a bullet wound. Not yet, not when her country still needed her. 6 weeks later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the military hospital's recovery ward, casting long shadows across Sarah Chen's face as she stood carefully, testing her weight on legs that had spent far too long confined to a hospital bed. The gunshot wound had missed her vital organs by centimeters, a fraction of an inch in any direction, and she would have died on that Black Hawk helicopter. The surgeons had worked for 7 hours to repair the damage, to reconstruct tissue and restore function. The recovery had been brutal, filled with pain that transcended mere physical sensation, entering into a realm where mind and body became indistinguishable. But she was alive. Against odds that would have broken most soldiers, against injuries that should have ended her, Sarah had fought her way back from the edge of death itself. The hospital room door opened, and Commander Blake entered, dressed in his dress blues, the formal uniform reserved for ceremonies and official occasions. Behind him came Chief Rodriguez, Lieutenant Patterson, and the rest of SEAL Team 7, each man impeccably uniformed, each man moving with the controlled precision of warriors preparing for something solemn and significant. Sarah immediately understood what was happening. She'd been briefed by the hospital commander that morning, told that this day would come, but understanding intellectually and experiencing the reality were vastly different things. "Agent Chen," Blake said formally, his voice carrying the weight of command even in this small hospital room. "The Secretary of Defense is here to present an official commendation." A tall woman in business attire entered behind the SEALs, carrying a small wooden box. She was Secretary of Defense Patricia Morrison, one of the most powerful figures in the Department of Defense. Behind her came 2 military photographers, their cameras ready to document this moment for official records. "Agent Chen," Secretary Morrison began, her voice filled with genuine respect. "On behalf of the United States Armed Forces and the American people, I am here to present you with the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration this nation can bestow. You risked your life, sacrificed your body, and demonstrated extraordinary valor in the face of overwhelming odds." Sarah's throat tightened as the secretary opened the box, revealing the distinctive medal, a star suspended from a blue ribbon, a symbol that meant more than words could adequately express. It represented sacrifice, heroism, and a commitment to duty that transcended self-preservation. "Your actions on the night of the operation resulted in the elimination of the Crescent Brotherhood's primary command structure," Secretary Morrison continued, reading from an official citation. "You neutralized the terrorist threat that was preparing to attack American civilians on our home soil. You prevented multiple coordinated attacks that would have resulted in thousands of deaths. And you did this while serving undercover for 18 months, operating alone, isolated from support, surrounded by enemies. Your courage is extraordinary. Your sacrifice is noted. Your nation is eternally grateful." The secretary placed the Medal of Honor around Sarah's neck. The weight of it was negligible, just a few ounces of metal and ribbon, but it felt like the heaviest thing Sarah had ever worn. Tears that she hadn't permitted herself to shed during 18 months of infiltration, during interrogation, during surgery and recovery, finally broke free and streamed down her face. "However," Secretary Morrison continued, "we must acknowledge the nature of your service. The public will never know your name. Your photograph cannot be released. Your deeds cannot be celebrated in newspapers or television or any public forum. Everything you've accomplished will remain classified. You will return to the shadows from which you came. But understand this, everyone in this room knows what you did. Everyone in the intelligence community knows. And your country knows, even if it cannot thank you openly." Sarah nodded, understanding the reality of her existence. She had chosen to become a ghost, a phantom, operating in the spaces between official reality and classified truth. The price of that service was anonymity, even in victory. The world would never know Agent Sarah Chen, but those who understood what truly protected the nation, those warriors and intelligence professionals operating in the shadows, would know. They would remember. They would honor her memory and her sacrifice. As Secretary Morrison and the photographers departed, Blake approached Sarah and stood at attention. Without speaking, without any command or instruction, the other SEALs arranged themselves in a line beside him. Their hands moved in unison, arms extending upward in perfect synchronization. 8 soldiers rendering a salute to a woman who had become legend, who had sacrificed everything for her country, who had proven that courage and commitment transcended rank or gender or official recognition. Sarah, still weak from her wounds, still moving carefully to avoid aggravating her injuries, returned the salute with the precision of someone who understood its significance. The gesture meant everything: respect, brotherhood, acknowledgement of shared sacrifice in service to something greater than themselves. "Welcome back, Agent Chen," Blake said quietly, his voice carrying emotions that regulations forbade him to speak aloud. "The world doesn't know what you did, but we know, and we will never forget." Sarah looked at the men before her, these warriors who had fought beside her, who had bled with her, who had carried her from a burning compound toward safety. They were her family now, bound by experiences that civilian life could never produce, connected by a commitment to duty that superseded personal recognition or reward. The tattoo on her shoulder blade, the mark of Operation Phantom Spear, was no longer just proof of her identity. It had become a symbol of sacrifice, of commitment, of a soldier willing to give everything for her nation, even knowing that the nation could never publicly acknowledge her gift. As she watched her fellow warriors render their salutes, Sarah understood finally that the truest honor wasn't in medals or ceremonies, wasn't in public recognition or official gratitude. The truest honor was in the respect of those who understood the cost of her service, who recognized her sacrifice without reservation, who would carry her memory forward into the darkness where they all operated. She was a ghost, she was a phantom, she was a legend. And that was enough.